Well, it's taken a lot of work to get to this point, but it's time to dirty up the Gladiator and get him finished. I'm going to start the weathering process by doing the feet separately. And I'm doing this simply because it'll be easier to get to each of them rather than having them connected to the legs, because these are going to have the heaviest weathering on the whole model. Now what I'm putting on here is some wilder, dark Russian textured earth. It's basically the same color as the model, but I'm not putting it on for the color. I'm putting it on for the stony texture. They have two different varieties of textured earth, stony, and then there's I don't remember, it's called fine or something, but it's got less of a chunky grain to it. This, you can see, is quite chunky mud. Now what I do is I put it on fairly heavily, but then I'll go back and remove a little bit of it with water. This is an acrylic product. It's not one of their reactivatable products, but it's still an acrylic product that's very easy to use. I am going to put some down in these holes here because I can imagine they would get quite muddy. Some of them I'll fill up, some of them I'll just do a partial, some I may leave fairly clean because I think that randomization makes sense. Now I'm going to clean my brush off in my handy dandy cup of water here, and then I'm going to come back in and just kind of spread that around, clean it off a few areas, let a little bit of that previous weathering and chipping that I did show through. Don't necessarily want to cover up everything. While that would be realistic, it doesn't show the other things on the model, and so this is where I try to depart a little bit from realism, is to allow the various things that have been put on there to show through. Now this will take a little while to dry. I can speed it up with a hair dryer, but once it dries, it'll give it a really stony, grainy, muddy look. Well, obviously this is take two because I've got some of this on here and realized I forgot to turn on my camera. But what I'm doing is I'm taking some more wilder weathering products. This is the light brown textured earth, and this is the fine grain. And I'll just, as before, I'll just put that on there like so, letting some of that grain get on there. Now you wouldn't have to use this product. You can, anything that has grain in it, even homemade stuff, will work perfectly fine for this. Then I just clean off my brush, get it wet, and then I just go in and reduce that down a little bit. Here I'm getting it to shift towards the color I want, which is a more brownish earthy color. But again, as with the previous layer, this is not the final color. This is more about texture. Now I'll use some of this Vallejo European Dust Model Wash, and I'm just going to go in and just stipple that on there. I want to coat the whole thing, but I want it to be in a fairly light coat. This is going to essentially color it the color that I want. Now if I would have had this color of the textured earth, I wouldn't have needed this step, but because I've only got the one very dark one and then the one very light one, and I wanted something kind of in the middle, this is kind of an intermediate step to get me to where I want. If you were doing this without these products, you were using some other products, the order is not necessarily what's important so much, or the products are not necessarily what's important so much, is just finding a way to impart the color that you want on there to be the final look of it. You can see here what that looks like. It's dirty, grainy, muddy. Some of the holes are filled up, but there's still just a hint of the original base treatments showing through. Now I've actually been working these in stages to make it easy for the video, So I've got to let these dry and then get them all up to this standard. But in the meantime, I'll move on to some other things. Now, part of the reason that I've not fully pushed the body onto the legs is because there's going to be some weathering that needs to happen here on the tops of this mechanical area, because while a lot of that will be protected from mud and grime and things like that, these outer edges, they can have things splashed up on them. There can be, I would imagine there's going to be grease and oil and other stains like that happening in there. So I want to do some weathering up in there by not pushing this down firmly, because it's held together with polycaps. I can keep it open so that I can work on it. I'm going to start off with this brown engine soot from Vallejo's Weathering Effects line. Now, this is a thick, pasty paint, but it doesn't really have much texture in it. But it's just very thick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off just pretty much applying this really heavily in all of these mechanical areas, because I'm just seeing, you know, there's grease up in here, there's oil, there's things dripping down from the engine, there's mud that gets up in here, there's all sorts of things going on. And I'll just kind of paint that on there fairly heavily. And then I'll go back in, and just like I did with the feet just a moment ago, I'll just thin that out and begin to spread that around, because I just want some grime in there. And every now and then I'll dab the water off onto a paper towel off camera. But I'll just move this around to set the basis for a really grimy, dirty look to these parts. Now, while that's drying, I've mounted up the 1 foot that's finished so that I can start weathering this leg and demonstrate how I'm going to do that. Now, the process going up the leg will be very similar to what I did on the foot, but instead of starting with the heavy texture, I'm just going to start with this light textured earth, because I don't want the heavier grains up there, because it's already got quite a bit of texture. The model already has quite a bit of texture on it. But what I'll do is I'll get this on there like that, and I'm going for, I want it to have a fairly consistent look with everything below it. Now, I've just glued this in, so I'm going to let that dry, but I'll go in and treat it with some of that also to get that looking grimy. I would not recommend putting the weathering on here before you glue it, because you may not be able to get it up into the little notch. But then using some of this water, I'm just going to blend that in a little bit so that the amount of grain and the amount of color just kind of reduces as it goes up the leg. And how far up you take it up the leg, that's completely up to you. And once again, using the European Dust Vallejo Model Wash, I just go in and put that along the leg here, coloring that lighter color to the little darker brown that I want. And there is no right or wrong. Weathering happens unevenly. Weathering is a serendipitous process. So, if one looks a little different than the other, one leg looks a little different, and this is just using water to blend this in up here at the top. But if it looks a little, one looks a little different than the other, or you see that you put too much water on and you want to go back and add some more color into it, you just kind of adjust it as you go. And while you want to be in control of the application and the technique, sometimes weathering just happens, and when you're working with one goal in mind, something else will pop up and you can take advantage of it. I'll let that dry, and that should look like mud splashed up from the foot, but higher up on the leg it's going to be a little cleaner. Hey, what do you know? I clipped my microphone on this time. I apologize for that. I'm getting old and forgetful. Alright, what I'm going to do now is, while I'm waiting for some of the stuff I've been working on with the legs to dry, I want to do some dust effects, starting up here on the hull of the model, and then I'll get down to the legs also. But for dust effects, I've always used these Vallejo model washes. So what I'm going to do is use 3 parts of this desert dust and then 1 part of this European dust, and then mix it up with an equal amount of water. And it's already a fairly opaque, or rather transparent product when it dries. It goes on more opaque than it dries. But what I'm going to do is, with it thinned down like this, I'm going to build it up in layers. And what I do is I start by just applying it in the lower areas where I think, okay, as dust is going to collect, it's going to collect closer to the ground than up at the top necessarily, as far as it goes on the sides. But this stuff will also count as kind of rain marks, because rain and dust go hand in hand on any kind of vehicle. The rain comes along and the dust clings to it, and then it dries up, and then more rain comes along and it moves it around a little bit, and then there's more dust on it. And so for the rain marks, I just do these streaks down like that with a lightly loaded brush. Now by watering it down, I'm making this so that once it dries, it's hardly apparent in one layer. You have to build this up. If you've ever seen Martin Kovac on night shift scale models, he does something similar with his rain marks mixture, which is a mix of Tamiya paints and soapy water. And I've tried that and it works really well, but in my experiments with it, I found it didn't really work that much different than this mixture that I've been using. I've actually been using this for quite a while. I'm certainly not the first one who's ever used it, but I've been using this going back to, I think the first time I used this type of mix was going back to a brutish dog build that I did, that I thought turned out pretty well. But anyway, this is an additive process, and I just do it a section at a time and let it dry a little bit, and just keep doing the same type of application, building it up slowly and getting it to look like I want. Remember, when you're using acrylics, it's an additive process where you're constantly adding on the product and building it up in layers. I'm going to do a little here along the top of the bedroll and down the sides, because that's going to certainly get dusty. With oils and enamels, it's subtractive. You put it on and then you use some kind of thinner to take it off. With this, it's additive. So I'm going to continue doing this and just building it up around the whole model, and then get it onto the legs also, and then we'll see how it looks from there. Dust is of course going to settle along the top of the vehicle too. So the way I like to apply this is just work a section at a time with kind of a stippling motion like that, and then just go back and work in the little blobs and dots that I put on, and just spread them around a little bit. And as it dries, it'll be a very light coating, but cumulative effect will be a dusty look. Now there's certainly other ways of doing this. You could use oils, you could use enamels, you could use pigments. There's quite a few ways of doing it. I like using these acrylics because they dry fast, and I like that better than oils and enamels, even though oils and enamels honestly are easier to work with in terms of adjusting the final outcome. And I like them better than pigments because pigments certainly give it a dusty look, because essentially it is dust, but then you have to figure out some way to fix them on or not handle the model ever again, and which is a bit of an exaggeration, but I mean, every time you handle it, the pigments come off. So by using this, it kind of hits a happy medium between all of them. Now I'm going to use that same rain marks / streaking mixture, and I'm going to just go in here and splatter that on to the sides of the model. I'm just using a large old brush and a toothpick. This stuff is going on fairly opaque, but it will dry much more transparent than this. And what I do is any that gets on the blanket, I'll blend in a little. I'm going to make sure to get plenty of it up here on this lower area. I'll have to flip the model over to get access to the underside. Now, if you get, I'm happy with this pattern, but if you get blobs that are larger than you want, just take your brush and just dab it around like that, and that'll spread things back out. You do want to watch and see if gravity pulls any of it down, and if it starts pooling, you want to keep an eye open for that. Now I want this area to appear a little dirtier. In fact, I want to leave just a few hints of clumps. Now I think my wilder stony texture might be a little more chunky than I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in some pigments in a few areas and then just touch this Vallejo model wash to it, which should fix it in place. Now I'll use a clean, dry brush just to dump in a few pigments like over here, knowing that the wash is going to thin down a lot of that. Then using a separate brush, I'll just touch this wash to those pigments and let the capillary action just kind of pull that around. When it dries, it should leave just a slight bit of texture. I can go back and just dab a little bit more pigment on there, and it'll soak into that wash. And then I can shake off the excess once it dries, and it'll leave a bit of a mud spot. The kit comes with this thin wire that is supposed to be an antenna, and it somehow mounts right here. So I'm going to have to drill out a hole big enough to fit this wire, and I think what I'm going to do is just try and get it in right there at that point. But I've just got a set of drill bits, and I found one that is just a little larger than the wire, and I'm just going to drill that in to get the antenna in. Also, if you do, like I have done a couple of times in this project, and break the little struts that go at the joint of the legs, this wire is the perfect size to cut out a replacement and glue it in there. I've cut my piece of antenna wire, and I put a blob of super glue here on this tile, and I'm just going to run that through it and pick up a blob of glue on the end. I'm just going to hold it like that and let it dry for a second. And what that'll do is it'll make a little knob on the end that's kind of like the plastic knobs that I remember we used to have on the ends of our antennas when I was in the Army. Now you can see it's got a little kind of knob there on the end, and I can stick that in the model and paint it, and it'll look like an antenna. On the end of the exhaust, I'm going to dry brush some Starship Filth. This is from Ammo of MIG. It's actually one of their oil brushers. I'm just going to brush that onto the end of the exhaust to just simulate soot and smoke and stuff like that. Now this is still drying, but you can see how adding the pigments and just a little bit of that wash leaves it looking a bit muddy and dirty. Okay, I cleaned up a little bit of painted surface on the model so that this glue will adhere to it. And so I'm going to glue on the exhaust. I'll glue in this smoke discharger right there. I'm only doing it on one side just to be different. The other side there's just a grab handle. I'm gluing in this guardrail piece here at the back, otherwise officially known as the piece you will break if you glue it on too early. Well, I think I'm ready to call this guy done. I'm quite happy with how this turned out. I'll admit, about halfway through the project, I was looking at, I think it was after I'd done the chipping and the initial rust staining, that I thought, I'm not really liking my choice of painting this thing OD, au drab. But now that I'm at the end and I'm looking at it and I've got it fully weathered and all the components on it and all the stuff in place, I'm really liking it. This is a fun kit. It's a hard kit to find, and when you find it, you're probably going to pay well over $100 for it. But I think it's worth it. The number of hours that fun that I got out of this kit, I think are well worth what I paid for it, because it's truly a wonderful build with so many opportunities for weathering and painting and effects, and it just looks really cool. And it's pretty big. I mean, it's stretching from this line to this line right here is 11 inches. So diagonally across, it's almost a foot across. So it's a fairly big model, and I think it looks really cool. And you know, I could have built it with the hatch open and even having the pilot inside of it. So there's even more possibilities that you can do with that. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this turned out. What a fun kit. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this video, especially if you're still hanging around here at the end. I'm always grateful for that. And I hope this video and this series has been enjoyable and perhaps helpful in giving you some ideas and ways that you could work on your own models, weather them, paint them, that kind of thing. So I hope it's been useful in some way. There is a subscribe link down over here. If you'd like to subscribe, I would be most grateful for that, and hit the little bell icon so that you'll know when I have new videos coming out. I would also be very grateful if you would give this video a thumbs up and drop a comment down below in the comment area. I always like hearing from people, and it does help me grow the channel, which is something I'm trying to do. And if you would like to support the channel, there is a link to Patreon down below, or you can click the little join link down over here so you can join on YouTube. And of course, if you're already a Patreon or YouTube supporter, thank you so much for supporting the work that I do. It is a blessing to me and my family, and I am so very grateful that you do that each month. It's what allows me to keep going, so thank you very much. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye. Finish one, start on the next.